Bueno, muy buenos días a todas y todos. Muchas gracias por su asistencia. Estamos en el ciclo de conferencias del Centro Estudios China-México de la Facultad de Economía de la UNAM, que coordinamos conjuntamente con la doctora Yolanda Trápaga y yo. Our session today will be in English, so I will switch to English. And again, we are very happy and very honored to count with a presentation of Professor Denis Simon. Before presenting him and giving him the word, I would simply remind you of a group of issues regarding the Center for Chinese-Mexican Studies, Cechimex. I invite you to see and download the videos and audios from the conferences since 2005. I think it might be of interest for many of you. I also invite you to see the cuadernos de trabajo del Cechimex, something like working paper Cechimex, with more than 60 working papers. The last one regarding the employment generation by China in Latin America and the Caribbean from a perspective of countries, but also from a sectorial perspective for the period 1995-2021. No, I think it's an interesting contribution regarding the relevance of China in Latin America. And I remind you, one of the astonishing results based on input-output tables is that regarding net trade, the impact of net trade of China in Latin America, the impact the trade on the employment generation in Latin America is larger by China than by the United States. Again, these are input-output tables from the OECD. Take a look at it. And we will, by the way, inform you very soon regarding the rest of the semester and the rest of the presentations that we will have every 2 weeks until the end of November. Today, we are very happy to have Professor and Dr. Denis Simon from the Kenan-Flagler Business School. I remind you, Denis is a professor at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill and the director of the Corporate Partner Program. He recently also left the Duke University, where he was related with the president of the university in different instances regarding China and the relationship with China and innovation possibilities with China. No? He has been also participating very actively with Chinese counterparts, and he has been visiting lots of different universities. We met this year in one event at Yenching Academy that some of you might know. UNAM also has an exchange program with the Yenching Academy, but also with Kunshan University, and he has also been working as a consultant with institutions, corporations, firms such as Anderson Consulting, always related to China. No? Among others, he received the Friendship Award in 2006 by the Prime Minister Wen Jiabao, and lots of analysis courses, publications, books related to China and innovation processes. No? So, Denis, thank you very much for your trust. Thank you very much for your participation. And again, the floor is yours.
Enrique, thank you for having me, and thank your colleagues for making time in their busy day to come to my presentation and attend it, whether they're live or online. We live in a technology-driven world, so any way that works is a good way. So I'm going to talk today about the technology issue particularly as it relates to China's relations with the West and, of course, with the United States in particular, and to give some sense of where China is headed in terms of its own innovation system, and why the rise of China, particularly the technological rise of China, has become such a big issue, and where it's likely to take us in the future. So I have a PPT. If we can open up the screen share, I will open up my PPT. So let's see.
We can perfectly see it.
Let's see here. Okay. Can you see that?
Yes, Dennis. Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, so you can see by the cover that I've produced here, this comes from The Economist, and it really does, a picture does tell 1,000 words. You know, it really gives us a sense that these two countries are at loggerheads with one another, and they really are trying to figure out, is there a high ground that they can take? Perhaps where they can get past some of this current difficulty, and it's a little bit hard to know right now. So let me see if I can make sure that this is working here. Okay, let's see.
Yes, very well.
Okay, there it goes. Okay, so you know, we have China, you know, here, a country now of 1.4 billion people, a very complicated place in which change is ubiquitous. Everything is in flux, and we don't. There are many things that simply are not transparent to us. Things happen, and we as so-called observers, trying to figure them out. And how China, as a country, relates to the rest of the world, and most important, how a more powerful, economically advanced China is going to integrate with the rest of the world, is probably one of the most important questions of the 21st century. And my focus is on science and technology. So I'm interested in China's role in the global innovation system, and how China's integration with that system might change the rules or change the operation of that system. So this is just one Chinese scientist among, you know, tens of thousands. And it used to be that China's lack of an adequate talent pool was an Achilles heel, but today talent has become one of the sources of competitive advantage for China. And today China is looking to further leverage its talent, including the return of more and more scientists who are coming back to China from around the world to work on projects and to deal with issues that are a high priority in terms of the Chinese government. Some of you may know Richard Freeman, who's a Harvard economist, who's also very active in NBER. And he produced an article a few years back, but that I thought was worthwhile referring to. He said that the way China deploys its science and technology resources will drive the direction of science and technology into the foreseeable future and the direction of our increasingly knowledge-based economy. And he goes on to quote Horace Greeley, who said to Americans, "Go west, go west." But Freeman says in the 21st century, science is going east and will grow up with China. And so this is an increasingly become a perspective that many who are active in science and technology are beginning to embrace, that China is no longer a laggard, but has become a very active participant in terms of global science and technology affairs. So let me kind of address then this big question, which of course is, what does China's rise mean for global competition in the 21st century? In the White House today, there is a National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. And when you look at Jake Sullivan's remarks about China, one can discern a concern, a sustained concern about that China's rise really is a voice for reshaping the prevailing rules of the game in international affairs. And what that means precisely is that China is no longer wanting to be a rule taker, but in fact, in many ways, it wants to be a rule maker. And many of the rules that China would like to put in place are not consistent with the liberal order that has been in place since the end of World War II, the so-called Bretton Woods order. For example, China believes in internet sovereignty, and most Western countries believe in the free flow of information across borders. And so if there were to be an international regime for management of the internet, and China was a very active player in that, what might the shape and configuration of that regime look like, given now that China has a powerful voice? And will there be other countries, for example, BRI countries, that sign on to the Chinese perspective because they've become close to China? So Jake Sullivan is one of these people that's worried that if you don't slow down China now, when we have a window of opportunity, China will be impossible to manage into the future. And thus, you see this hard line that's taken, even though, as I'll tell you, many people expected the Biden administration to have a more moderate policy towards China, but actually the policy not only has continued the Trump era policies, but in some ways have become even more tough line. Now, of course, we also know that China is a major force in global affairs because of its domestic market, and that even, for example, the recent restrictions on semiconductor chip sales to China and the sale of equipment to China is having a significant impact on major companies like Intel, Qualcomm, etc., because China is a big market for these kinds of products. And the profits that were coming from those are profits that would fund the research that these companies use to stay in the forefront. Without profits from China, what will happen? So this is also a big question. China is also big because it has buying power, or I say not. If China chooses to buy Australian wheat or Canadian wheat, or chooses not to buy it, it has a big impact. So China's activities are monitored closely, particularly those in certain commodity industries where China's decisions to buy big or not can have a long-term impact. As I noted before, China is also a big source for R&D, and I'll show you some data in a minute about that. And it's also a growing source of talent. And more recently, over the last 10 years, I would argue since 2012, China has become now a driver of demand for new technologies and for innovation. And in certain industries, as we know, China now is at the cutting edge, everything from AI to electric vehicles. China also is a major source of capital around the world. Its investments as well as its loans are important. And whether you look at China as the agent of debt diplomacy, or you look at China as an agent of development, with over $3 trillion in foreign exchange reserves, at least up to now, China has a significant impact. Also military power, and also, again, I think my point going back to Jake Sullivan, it's a country with different norms, different values, and therefore its behavior is different. Very hard to mirror image what we want to do in the West and what China intends to do in the future. So we've entered what I would call a new phase of global competition. Global competition is no longer about price, who can make the cheapest widget or the cheapest component. Competition today is built around 4 or 5 key areas. I note here, talent is critical, IP, who can generate the best IP, patent wars. We've seen lots of conflict over patents. And standards, technical standards. China has become extremely aggressive in the international standard agencies in terms of helping to set standards that are consistent with where China wants to see certain industries and certain technologies move. And China is also active again in the BRI countries, some 60 plus countries, in helping them to adhere to Chinese oriented standards rather than Western standards. Again, something that's quite important. So what we've seen now, and I think this is important to understand this transition, in 1979, the United States normalized its relations with China, and they restarted their diplomatic relationship. And for the next sort of 25 years or so, the United States policy was based on a very simple notion. A stable, modernizing China is in the interest of China, the interest of the United States, and in the interest of the world. And with that as the guiding principle, that led to the growth in trade, including membership in WTO for China, growth in foreign investment. Almost every Fortune 500 company is in China today, growing educational exchanges, reaching a max of 370,000 Chinese students in the United States. Growing science and technology cooperation, growing tourism. In fact, as I say here, growing everything. China was that market of 1 billion that had been the dream going back to the 19th century, seemed to steadily become a reality. In 2006, China launched its indigenous innovation program, that it started to shift from being factory to the world to start to become an innovation-driven economy. And as that started to occur, a new perspective developed. And I just quote here one perspective. China's rise represents an existential threat to the well-being of Western democracies and a threat to the future prosperity of the United States. Or you can put in any Western country in there. And so what's happened over the period, particularly over the period of the last 6 or 8 years, we've started to reconfigure supply chains. And of course, that has some consequences for Mexico. We've started to expand the export controls, sometimes called high fences around narrow areas. But if you're sitting in Beijing, it seems that there are just more fences around more areas. Imposed limits on educational exchanges, such as identifying the so-called 7 sister universities, in which people who are from or associated with those universities can't get visas to come to the US. A growing fear that civil-military fusion, the dual-use technology problem, is becoming even more significant. And this idea of China as an international rule breaker. I said, well, China was a rule taker, or maybe wanted to be a rule maker. But in the middle of that is China as an international rule breaker, that China's success is gotten there by hook or by crook. And therefore, the uneven playing field has worked to the Chinese advantage in order to propel China's growth forward. So you get covers on The Economist like this, the US versus China in a ring, the big vicious panda bear and Uncle Sam. Or you got the world, according to Xi Jinping, in which Xi Jinping seems to be able to call the shots, particularly in terms of the relationship with Russia about Ukraine, North Korea, and a number of other issue areas. So just as the Western views changed, I think we can also discern a change in Xi Jinping's thinking. And that is from the first few years of his stay in power, from 2012 to about 2016, approximately, Xi Jinping was all about embracing openness, embracing collaboration. He went out of his ways to embrace ties with the US. He really wasn't extremely aggressive about Taiwan at that time. His goal was to keep the economy growing, because that was the way that he could enhance the place of the Communist Party in power. And also, finally, as I indicated, to become a more innovation-driven nation with global connectivity. But somewhere, when the Trump administration arrived and the launch of the trade war started, we started to hear from Xi Jinping very vociferous complaints about the US and its allies, and words like containing China, suppressing China, encircling China. And I don't think this is his imagination, by the way. I think that there is some substance to what he is talking about. More active threats about Taiwan and the recovery of Taiwan, tougher policies on Hong Kong, and then two or three other things. China's Great Revival, the so-called China Dream, as he called it. Under Deng Xiaoping, it was the Chinese policy to keep a low profile as China's rise was taking place. But under Xi Jinping, it's time to come out of the closet and to reveal, here is this big, strong China, and we're no longer going to take, crap from anybody else. Xi also obviously continued his notion that he has to strengthen party leadership, and this is a big part of his commitment. And something really interesting, the one element that he has retained is this commitment to global engagement. In May, I gave a talk at the Zhongguancun High-Tech Forum, which has been going on for about 20 years. And the theme of the forum this year was open innovation for a shared future. And there were over 80 international S&T related organizations. There were S&T counselors from all the major embassies. And I would make the argument that China was trying to strongly demonstrate that despite all of these restrictions and everything, China still is open for business, and China remains open to international collaboration. So we may see political tightening, but we're also seeing a recognition that China needs to be globally engaged. It needs the movement and mobility of scientists, engineers, knowledge across borders in order to sustain its advance. So we've seen then this transition go from, in the first period, where the relationship was highly asymmetrical, it lacked parity, there was extreme hierarchy in terms of the way US and China related to one another, a great deal of inequality in terms of capability, and the relationship during that period can more or less be defined as that between a teacher and a student, and it reflected that kind of dynamic. After 2006, we started to see these changes, and they became more pronounced after 2012. There started to be greater symmetry, a closer approximation to parity in many fields, with China even being a leader in some aspects of science and technology, much less hierarchy in political as well as technical terms, and also greater equality. If you have this kind of transition, and you look at the interactions between the countries, you have to see that the ingredients that make the two work together, if they are going to work together, will have to change. That the same formula for success in that first period clearly was not going to continue to be a formula for success in the future. Now, much of this is based on a very important recognition. As little as about 10 years ago, even in publications like the Harvard Business Review, there were people writing articles about the idea that China cannot innovate, that China just basically, because of its political system, because of its culture, etc., simply could not become an innovation-driven nation. But that idea now has proven to be obviously obsolete, and that China, in fact, is no longer an innovation laggard. McKinsey wrote an interesting report called The China Effect on Global Innovation, and they separate innovation into 4 categories, and they try to show that, okay, China may be good at the efficiency innovation and even engineering innovation, but China's Achilles heel continues to be science-based innovation. But the Chinese realize that they can no longer solely depend on the West and the openness of the West to access knowledge, and that they too have to begin their investment in their own basic knowledge generation. Now, the reason that we can say China's been a success in efficiency-driven and customer-focused, and even some degree of engineering-based innovation, is that just look at the reality. China is now the largest automobile producer in the world. It's also the largest producer and exporter of electric vehicles. It also landed the first probe on the dark side of the moon in 2019, and already is launching components of its space station in 2021. And companies like Alibaba, Baidu, Huawei, Tencent, Lenovo, etc., are part of a group of 8 to 10 companies that are the fastest companies in the world to reach a 1 billion valuation. And granted, there's some problems and some issues that Alibaba and the other companies have faced recently, but still, these are dynamic, technology-driven companies that operate differently than the general state-owned enterprises we've usually associated with China. Also, China is no longer a copycat economy. It's advanced to what I would call a global integrator and has been able to bring together technologies from a number of different places. The best example, of course, is China's high-speed rail, which now has over 23,500 miles of rail in place. And it's also continued to produce a maglev train, where the speeds will go above 385 miles per hour. How has this been done? One, through more reform, particularly reform of the R&D system. Two, improvements in the management of talent, including bringing back more talent from abroad. Three, the enhancement of higher education so that universities like Tsinghua and Peking University and Fudan are now part of the global top 20 universities. And also more efficient use of funding across the system. China no longer is wasting all this money that it did, though again, it's not perfect. As we saw in semiconductor, it has thrown a lot of money down the toilet, but still, it generally has improved. So if you're sitting in Washington, D.C., or sitting in London, or sitting in Paris, or Frankfurt, and etc., you're going to look around the world and you're going to see what's going on in China. We see acceleration of technological progress. We see success coming from a lot of rule-breaking activities. We see continued, questions about the integrity of Chinese practice for IPR protection. Also, continued concerns about trade. Even though there's been improvement, there's still a major imbalance. And we also see evidence, not as widespread as people would suggest, but nonetheless, active industrial espionage and continued evidence of cyber hacking all over the place. Programs such as Made in China 2025, even though they're not talked about much anymore, they represent an attitude about how to grow the economy using a strong status modality that includes big subsidies for promoting new technology advancement. And again, some of that already has paid off. I mentioned, for example, in terms of electric vehicles. There's also been evidence of ongoing pressure for forced technology transfer. We'll give you market if you give us access to your technology. And that dynamic has continued to remain in place, probably to a far greater degree than most Western companies appreciated. And finally, lots of attempts to exert extensive political influence through Chinese soft power. Some people have said the Confucius Institutes are like that, but I think far more concern is the police stations that China allegedly has set up in places like New York City to keep tabs on people who are Chinese lawbreakers, not just perhaps American lawbreakers. So these kind of factors are basically what produced the concern. And so it raises the question about which is the real China. China as an international rule taker following the Bretton Woods system, China as an international rule breaker where it defies some of the rules of the game, like about IP, or China increasingly, and where it desires to be, is an international rule maker, reshaping many of the old rules of the day and adopting a position that many in the US and other Western countries consider to be antithetical to their core belief systems, etc. Now, all of this occurred because of something that I call China's strategic innovation triangle. Three pieces to this. It started in 2006 with the 15-year medium to long-term plan for science and technology, and that plan was renewed again in 2021 to 2035. It is the core plan for China to become stronger at indigenous innovation. Doesn't mean self-reliance indigenous innovation. It means generating more IP, more intellectual capital from Chinese sources, and not just basically borrowing or even stealing from the West. It also includes a medium to long-term plan for higher education. It was a 10-year plan, and now in terms of the double first class program, this has continued to help strengthen Chinese universities, particularly with increased investment. And finally, a medium long-term talent plan, which also now is sort of played down because of the trouble associated with the 1,000 talent program. But nonetheless, China is still in the talent cultivation, talent retention, and talent development business, a very important part. And given the history from during the Cultural Revolution about where intellectuals were, today the treatment of intellectuals is almost 180 degrees different. So what has this produced? If you look at the Global Innovation Index between 2019 and 2022, just to take a short-term view, China has gone from 14th to 11. In other words, it's making progress, and it continues to make progress. And if you look at the trajectory of where it's going to be in terms of the forecast, China in 2020 was sort of near the bottom of this list, and you can see the trajectory, the slope of the curve, or where China is going to be by 2026. Now, when these things were done, of course, they didn't look at the COVID impact and the post-COVID slowdown. And there is a big question about whether or not the funding can be sustained to support this kind of growth of China's technological advance. But at least this is where the projection is taking us. And you can see the changing face of global innovation. Companies like Huawei, Alibaba, Lenovo, etc., are now on the list of the top 25, and more Chinese companies will soon be joining that list in the near future. The top R&D spending countries in the world, again, look to the right side of this pie chart. You can see the United States is still number one, but China now has become number two. That's very interesting because just 10, 12 years ago, China was spending 1% or less of its GDP on R&D, and today it's already past 2.5%. This is sort of another way to take a look at that same data and give you a sense of the differential from where China is and where, for example, the EU is today. This is, I put this up here for a reason, and that is that you can see that China obviously is one of the big circles on here. But one of the interesting things is that China's researchers per million population is still fairly low. When you have a population of 1.4 billion people, to command the kind of density of scientific talent that, say, South Korea has all the way at the right end, would mean you'd have to grow talent by literally the tens of thousands. And China is training people abroad, it's training people at its own universities, but still, there is a talent shortage in China, even though we know this year 11, 12 million people graduated from universities. These are not doctorates. These are undergraduate people. They can become lab techs. They may become junior scientists, but they're not, of the quality of the people being trained at Tsinghua or Beida in terms of, PhD level. Now, I mentioned that China's R&D spending has been growing. Basically, the growth is interesting, almost 2 times as fast as the growth of GDP. And finally, in 2022, it reached 2.55% of GDP. You may know 2.5% is a magic number. So China just made it over that number. It had hoped to do this by 2020, a little bit delayed. Again, probably COVID was the reason, but it made this 2.5, which is a big leap forward. And how this is all emerging is that China has already passed the EU 30, and that somewhere around 2025, 26, at least it was alleged that it would pass to the United States. And so, you have to ask yourself the question, when the New York Times or Wall Street Journal headline is, China surpasses the US in R&D, and then the next few days, China surpasses the US in GDP growth, what's the symbolic meaning of all that if you're sitting in a Western country that was once the dominant player? And so today, as I said, we can call China perhaps an innovation juggernaut. It spent over 3 trillion yuan on R&D. But if you look near the bottom of this, it says that spending on basic research, which had been below 5% for many years, now account for over 6.3% of total R&D spending. This is a big increase and a big statement in terms of Chinese science. So how did we get there? How did this all happen? Well, it isn't, by magic. It isn't by conspiracy. It isn't by secret formula. China has put in place a whole variety of reforms in the financial sector, the economic sector. It's had an open up policy. It's also introduced reforms in science and technology, as well as education. And it's also used this model of state capitalism. And it's this model of state capitalism that really is the source of heartburn. So what we've gone from is from a very strong state-directed, top-down Soviet-style planned economic and technology model to a very diversified mixed model combining both state and market into what is called this new Chinese economic and technology model of state capitalism. But I want to remind everyone that everything is in flux. A few years back, Xi Jinping decided that he wanted to return to giving more emphasis to the state-owned enterprises and launched a big, attack against the so-called new technology firms. But now we've seen a change. He's realized that if he were to kill those technology firms, he would kill the golden goose that's going to drive China's innovation edge into the future. And so he's backtracked now. And his agent for doing this is the new premier, Li Qiang, who's now become the advocate for a new mantra for entrepreneurs. And that he is now trying to overcome the damage that was done by Xi Jinping's crackdown on these high-tech firms. And a number of things have happened, including a new rallying cry for not only private enterprise, but also now for foreign investment. And we saw last week, China announced a whole new set of regulations to help promote FDI. Now, this is all part of an effort to build out the digital economy in China, including a smart infrastructure, as well as develop a space infrastructure for advanced communications and telecommunications that involves over 200 Chinese companies. So you can see that this is a country that's not standing still. And so if you're sitting in Washington, D.C., and you're looking all of this happen, China's pushing lots of buttons, pulling lots of strings, playing by good rules and bad rules, and it's sort of unnerving. And so this is a picture again from The Economist. You see on the right side the global system, and China is snapping off as if China is trying to reconfigure the global economy. And this is, again, the source of heartburn for many people. So what has the U.S. done? The U.S. basically taking this idea that China is an existential threat to the United States. It's put in place a number of policies restricting certain kinds of students and scholars, expanding the entity list, which is the companies that the U.S. firms can do business with in China. They must get formal approval through a review process. A greater tightening of export controls, including the October 7th decision last year about semiconductors, new restrictions that were just announced again this past week about foreign direct investment and venture capital investment into China by U.S. companies, existing restrictions through CFIUS on foreign investment by Chinese firms, a whole litany of things now, the last of which is the establishment of this new China committee led by Representative Gallagher, who's now become an anti-China voice that's barking loud and strong across Washington, D.C. about the threat from China and, most important, the Communist Party. And the two best examples of these, semiconductor I talked about, the launch of the Chips and Science Act, and then finally the regulation of TikTok, which is being used as a big case to deal with the issues of data protection, data privacy, data access. When I put this slide together a couple of days ago, the number was 150 million users, but I think it's already reached over 200 million users now. And Trump tried to shut it down. Biden sort of reversed the decision, but now he wants to shut it down. We don't know where this is all going to end up. The CEO of TikTok testified before Congress, and no matter what he said, he simply couldn't please the congressmen and women that somehow TikTok was not an agent of the Communist Party, and that all the data about TikTok users were going to end up in the hands of Xi Jinping at some point. So that even though the servers that TikTok uses are run by Oracle in the United States, there is this sense that if one day Xi Jinping says, I want the data, TikTok is going to have to transfer all of it back to Beijing somewhere, and it'll be a big CCP data grab. So these are things that, again, are unnerving and destabilizing to the relationship. In fact, there's a kind of funny side to this. I was thinking about this the other day, and I said, you know, it's kind of interesting. All the big issues in U.S.-China relations begin with the letter T, starting with Trump and going all the way down to travel. We've just now renewed, as you know, the number of flights that can occur between the two countries. But since COVID, they had been cut back dramatically, which meant that the engagement between the two countries had been limited. But they include everything from Tibet, Taiwan, TikTok, the Internet of Things, climate change and temperature, technical standards, et cetera, et cetera. If you have a list of these and you can figure out how to solve most of these, you'd basically be able to solve most of the problems in U.S.-China relations. Now, all of this has led to now a reconfiguration of the global supply chain, or at least the process has started. I would argue that this is very tough to accomplish. It's not an easy thing to do. Because many multinational companies that we know about, household names, for the last 25, 30 years, they've spent tremendous amounts of time, energy, and capital to build a dynamic, reliable supply chain across China. And now they are being asked to undo this for security reasons, for political reasons. So a lot of companies have made noise that they're about to do this, though as the data from one of the most recent surveys indicated, everyone says they're going to do it, but only about half the people really have done anything. It's hard to undo this. I would argue that this is a particular area that has relevance for Mexico because of Mexico's role in industries like the automobile industry and parts and components and other industries. Whatever happens here could be very important. But of course, look what's happening already. India is starting to step in. Just a few 2 months ago, Tim Cook made this big trip to India, got a lot of noise across the Indian government and also in the United States. This dovetailed very nicely with a push by the Biden administration to try to strengthen links with India as an offset to China in many ways. And Apple, you know, if Apple makes a big decision about moving stuff out of China and into India, that's going to reverberate all over, not just China, but Taiwan as well. We've seen some effort, but what's interesting already is that even efforts to move some of the supply chain to Southeast Asia, the companies that are being invited to join happen to be owned by Chinese. So it can't be a clean seller in terms of divorcing from China. It's going to be very difficult. So what does this all mean? In 1978-79, when this all began, China was basically outside the Western economic, science and technology and trading system. It had limited participation. It was following a kind of old type of self-reliance, in Chinese, the zili gongsheng, and it had very limited international scientific advance. In other words, it was on the margins. It was a peripheral player. In 2023, China is a very active player. It's involved in all major global issues. It's a favorite site for R&D increasingly. Prior to COVID, there were over 1,800 foreign investment R&D sites. The number has declined a bit, but there is all more investment going into some of these. And China now has also become an important transnational collaborator. And we can look at scientific journals and look at the primary co-authorships. US and China are the #1 cohort involved. So the question is, if you've got this transition, what is it going to mean ultimately? So we've seen from the collaboration over the last 40 years, this has not been a one-way street. China clearly has been the beneficiary, both in the education sector, for example, with the growth of research universities, the improvement in terms of curriculum and things of that sort, and also in science and technology, including the establishment of the Natural National Science Foundation, which is modeled after the US NSF. And so that's been a very important part. The STEM pipeline that came to the US to be educated. Lots and lots of those PhDs stayed in the United States and today are part of our faculties at some of the best universities across the US. If there were to be a stoppage or a dramatic slowdown, one would wonder how would the United States sustain the needs it has in its pipeline, particularly in fields like AI, quantum computing, and those other cutting-edge fields. We've seen the success in projects like clean energy come to fruition, and we've seen success in the business commerce area as well. China as factory to the world, let's not be mistaken, was of a benefit to everybody, to consumers around the world in terms of lower cost products and services, and also in terms of reliability of supply. Even during the COVID, all those masks and gloves and hazmat suits that we got in the United States, they all came from China. So let's not forget that, how important China was. And also in terms of major multinationals, no China market, GM does not exist today. No China market, Boeing would be in serious trouble. And so all of these things we've got to remember are part of the equation. So finally, just in closing, let me talk about how do we move these two pieces of a puzzle together so maybe they could fit together more smoothly. Things have changed a bit, and I want to cite in here a particular report, ITIF, which is the International Technology Information Technology and Innovation Foundation in Washington, said that today many elites in the United States comfort themselves with a narrative that China, at least under the leadership of Xi Jinping, cannot really become truly innovative, and therefore the United States has little to worry about. And they go on to say, based on their studies, that simply is no longer true. That China has made recent gains in space, genomics, AI, quantum computing, that this definition of China as an innovation laggard needs to be corrected. And therefore, is the answer really slowing down China, or is it doing something that's going to enhance the US performance in ways that were done back in American history? And they go on to cite the role of Hamilton during the early years in terms of gaining independence from England, Roosevelt in terms of creating the arsenal of democracy, and then more recently, you can call what Biden has done with things like the Chips and Science Act. The question is whether America is going to meet this challenge or not, and how is it going to shrink? Well, for China, the situation has become much more difficult. And what it saw under globalization as a rather smooth pathway to the future has now become much more complicated as we've entered a period of what we would call fragmented globalization. And China's ability to achieve its strategic goals now are being impeded because of suspicions about what's going on in terms of China's global behavior, whether it's through front companies or non-traditional collectors or intelligence services or use of academic collaboration and research partners. There's a sense that China is out there to undermine the integrity of the Western research system. When they asked a group of 2,500 US companies, what's your future, biggest threat that you face? 51% said Chinese competition, and 47% said unforeseen technology breakthroughs, some of which can come from China. So technological surprise from China is something that we need to be concerned about if we stay ahead. So where are we going to be in the coming 5 years? I think that the relationship between China and the West is going to continue to be a difficult one and a complex one. And I think that the US really is not going to back away from the decoupling or at least de-risking posture that it's taking in terms of engagement with China. And it's using this posture to sell it to its allies in Europe and also in Asia. Reality is that trust continues to be missing on all sides, hard to find common ground. And with the curtailment of travel, even people-to-people diplomacy, there is too little dialogue and too little discussion. And therefore, that has led to a rise in anti-China feeling across the US. It's the highest it's been in decades, some 82 or 83%, according to the most recent surveys. The main cause of the West's discomfort is simply not going to go away. China's rapid rise as a major player is something that the West is going to have to learn to live with. We're not going to see, as many people would hope, that the current downturn is going to produce a long-term collapse. This doesn't likely describe the future that we're going to see. And therefore, I think Xi Jinping is not wrong in his assessment about U.S. efforts to constrain and contain China's growth. This is the U.S. policy with its allies, and this in working with whether it's Australia and Japan, working with European countries, this is what the U.S. wants to see. The cancellation of the first Blinken trip was unfortunate, even though we've had a trip take place, because there had been some pretty good momentum when Biden and Xi Jinping met in Bali. But since that, the communication has been very uneven. We have Blinken, Yellen, and Kerry go to China, and then a few days later, we see the imposition of new restrictions on investment, discussion about not renewing the S&T agreement, et cetera, et cetera. So the only way China can get around this, of course, is to re-strengthen its commitment to its own self-reliance, because it needs large state-directed investment to be able to keep pace in fields like semiconductors, which are critical building blocks in fields such as electric vehicles, AI, etc. So China has a very comprehensive plan to build this, everything, from semiconductors, including deep space, deep earth, polar research, brain science. Some of these areas, interestingly, could be the target for better bilateral, multilateral collaboration, like brain science, like finding a cure for cancer. But whether or not they will merge, we don't know. I think we saw at least the tone of where China is headed from the so-called two sessions meeting in March, where they set a framework for China's post-COVID development, including the effort to restore the role of private enterprise. And I think that we need to be watchful of what's going on. Tom Friedman, in an article written some years ago, talked about command China and network China. And he talked about it in terms of sort of Hegelian dialectic. They run up opposite one another, but they also create what is produced, and we call state capitalism. But it seems that whereas private enterprise had been in the ascendancy, it was pushed back by Xi. Now they're trying to push it ahead again. Whether or not that will happen, we don't know. The change from Trump to Biden, unfortunately, did not bring with it the moderation in U.S. policy that everyone thought was going to happen. U.S. is particularly not happy about Xi Jinping's close relationship with Putin and Moscow. That hurts things. If China were to be seen as selling any kind of arms to Russia, that would really be one of the worst developments that can happen in terms of China's relationship with the West, and could do almost irreparable damage. On the other hand, I would remind everyone, there is no global challenge out there. Clean energy, global climate change, pandemics, you name it, in which some meaningful solution will not depend on close U.S.-China, U.S.-Europe collaboration. We need one another, and that's something we can't ignore and we can't forget. So the major question is, with all of these tensions and all of these hyperbole that's going on, how long can we continue without some kind of serious confrontation? And most likely a serious confrontation caused by a miscalculation due to the poor state of communications between the two countries. So on the one hand, China wants to achieve three things: become an innovative nation, maintain stability internally by going forth with this harmonious society started with Hu Jintao, and continue to be engaged globally so it can benefit from what's going on all around the world. But what kind of leadership does that mean in terms of China's role? And will the West accept China's leadership role at the table side by side with the US and the European countries and Japan? This is the big question out there. I say that we're headed for the edge of the cliff, and I think that we're driving closer and closer to that edge. And at stake are some really big concrete things. This is not just symbolic, this is really important. Access to each other's markets, access to innovation hotspots in both countries and elsewhere in the world, synergies from the collaboration that had taken place in the past, ability to work on common global problems together. Lord knows we need to do something yesterday about global climate change. cooperation in space exploration. The U.S. clearly is falling further and further behind, and then access to talent, of which both countries need that on both ends of the spectrum to generate their research. So as this go forward, just remember one thing in China studies. The only surprise will be if there are no surprises. So whatever I've said, whatever I've projected, there's always the proviso that this is China and something will come out of left field and change the game. But with that in mind, I will stop here and take any questions you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Denis, for your very interesting presentation. I particularly enjoyed the effort of presenting some different concepts and not falling into this description trap with lots of charts, lots of data, and at the end you understand less than at the beginning. No, so thank you very much. No. There are already a couple of questions. Before these questions, and so that the audience and colleagues can also present some questions, I would like to highlight two issues that might allow you to respond to some of them. No, the first question that you partially responded, Denis, is regarding the short-term relationship between the U.S. and China. No, I am particularly worried regarding this relationship for the period August 2023, November 2024, elections in the United States, where the two main parties have very few common issues, no? But probably the only or main common issue is to be against China. No? And this worries me a lot in this electoral discussion until November of 2024, so we can witness an escalation. But I would be interested in your analysis and opinion regarding all the discussion regarding security shoring. No? This is national security is the main topic above trade, technology, immigration, and whatever. And the second topic, Denis, regarding your very concrete experience based in a university working for decades on exchanges and cooperation between the United States and China on innovation issues, on creating universities, etc. What has been your experience even before COVID-19 pandemic, etc.? I believe that the exchange and cooperation options and possibilities in the academic sector have fallen drastically. No, the closing Confucius Institute, but also in China, new restrictions, etc. So what has been your experience in this concrete field? Before again, and I don't know if you can see the questions in the chat.
Yeah, I can see them, yes.
Otherwise, I would be happy to help you. No?
Okay.
Please.
Okay, let me take your second question first, okay? So I was the executive vice chancellor for Duke Kunshan University, which is a joint venture university between Duke, Wuhan University, and the city of Kunshan. And we recruited some 125, 150 faculty directly. They weren't Duke faculty. 75, 80% of the faculty were hired directly into tenure track jobs. And the other 25% had to be so-called Duke affiliated faculty. This was a requirement for accreditation and a requirement by the Chinese government so that we didn't deliver a so-called watered down Duke degree, that we gave a real Duke degree. And by 2019, we had established 11 functioning research centers at the joint venture university. A number, of course, were in STEM fields, including applied technology and medical physics. A number were in policy areas, environmental policy, health policy, and then a number were in the humanities. And I will include in here Chinese studies and different facets of humanity. So it was a broad-based set of research centers. Now, we had a faculty that came from 14, 15 different countries. So export controls theoretically applied to the Americans and didn't necessarily apply to all the other faculty who are not subject to American rules. And as you know, extraterritoriality in China does not apply. So only it applied to Americans because they had to go home eventually. They couldn't be seen as breaking any rules. So for example, in 2018 or 2019, it was the city of Kunshan offered to give us money to build a semiconductor research center at DKU. But Duke University stepped in and said, you can't do that. That's inconsistent with export control. So back in that period, again, we already under the Trump administration's influence began to see the impact of universities becoming much more sensitive to those faculty participating in so-called sensitive areas. And we also had a faculty member who came from engineering at Duke, who also had a business. And he established a research institute that was focused on advanced optics. Advanced optics provide the technology that's used in facial recognition. And so there was a fear that his technology would be utilized for nefarious purposes. Now, the faculty member was a little bit crazy, and he said, the Chinese are going to use some technology, they might as well use my technology. But that was not very consistent with what Duke wanted to hear. So basically, the lab was shut down and the faculty member was brought home. And so I use that as an example to show you that the interest in collaborative research is important because China also had a lot of money, and the DKU faculty were eligible to receive Chinese government funding, but they had to be according to the agenda of China. And so there was this tension between what could be allowable under US law. Now, if you were from Korea or you were from India or you were from another country, you may not have been subject to that because the joint venture operates under the rules and regulations of the People's Republic of China. But there is this notion that joint venture universities, whether they were UK like Nottingham or Liverpool, or they were US like NYU, did not want to be seen as running afoul of their home government's policies. So that's number one. Number two, most recently, you may know, but I'll just tell your audience, I resigned from my current academic post. I resigned because I received a 3-person delegation from the Chinese embassy, and I did not seek out official approval to have those people come, because for the last 40 years, I've been receiving Chinese embassy people on the campus where I was teaching or doing as an administrator. And I was told that having these people on campus is not consistent with my academic appointment. And I began to see this as an albatross on my neck. And I said that I don't want to be at this place. This is not my values. And I basically handed in my resignation. There is a difficult, complex process put in place. If you want to go to China and you're using US funds, you must go through a gauntlet. Review by the Export Control Office, review by the security officer, review by the Global Affairs Vice Provost, review by the Research Provost. You can't take your university computer to China. You can't log on from another computer into China. And the reason I was told was that China Telecom or China Unicom use Huawei equipment, and Huawei equipment is not accepted in the United States. Therefore, you can't connect with the United States from when you are in China. So this is, to be blunt, a kind of madness to me. And so I think we have entered a period of real difficulty. And we send Blinken, Yellen, and Kerry saying we want to mend fences, but at the same time, we do something that's diametrically opposed in terms of our behavior. So, and universities, the reason why they're doing this, by the way, is that they're fearful that the federal government will take away their federal funding in other areas if they're seen as becoming too friendly to China. in terms of your first question, I think you hit the nail on the head. We are in election season. And the one thing that the Democrats and Republicans both agree on is that they don't like China. And the one thing that Biden doesn't want to lose in terms of some two-party consensus is the fact that these two parties do talk the same language about Chinese affairs. And so he doesn't want to break them asunder because there's everything else they don't see eye to eye on. This is one of the one or two issues that they agree with. I think for the next 12 months, we are going to be in a very difficult period. I am hopeful that Xi Jinping's visit to the APEC meeting in the United States could provide an opportunity for Biden and Xi Jinping to talk. But I wonder what they're going to put on the table. That's the question. How are they going to show goodwill and rebuild trust in terms of specific activities? So it was good news that the flights are going to be restored, not all of them, but a number of them. You know, we were down to like 35 after being at 350. So we have a long way to go before we catch up on the flights. But you know, if your university has already decided that they're going to do their Chinese language program in Taiwan instead of in the mainland, if the State Department rates travel to China category 3, which means that you should not go if you don't have to go, that's what that means. I think that we're in for some tough dealings, and we can have dialogues and we can have conversations, but we really need some concrete examples to give evidence that both sides can really work together. That's why I was hoping that Kerry might come away with a project or two that would give us some room to begin, you know, playing around together. But that doesn't seem to have happened. So, okay, the first question you have over here is, what happened in 2006 that changed things? So 2006 was the launch of the medium long-term science and technology plan, in which the Chinese talked about for the first time indigenous innovation. And indigenous innovation began to be seen, according to some people, as a big ripoff, that China basically was out to grab all the Western technology that it could, and that if you wanted to do business in China, you were going to have to give up a great deal of technology, and that China was going to use subsidies and other forms of support to advance China's technological capabilities on a pathway to catch up with the West, and that this unfair playing field, subsidies, supports, preferential treatments, et cetera, these were all going to enable China to compete effectively with the West, and therefore really change the perspective of what was going on. Now, this is also related to the next question, which is about why is China an international rule breaker? And the person asks, is this only about IP? IP, of course, is one of the biggest pieces of it. There is no doubt that China's violations of IP, you know, I don't believe that, you know, Microsoft lost, you know, $5 billion because not everyone in China was ready to buy a $500 version of Microsoft Office. But at the same time, there were rather conspicuous examples of IP violation in which Chinese courts, not only did they not side with the foreign partner, but if there were punitive damages, they paid very little. So the cost of violating the rules was very limited to the Chinese side. But there's a whole litany of things associated with the WTO, commitments that supposedly China made, particularly with the liberalization of financial markets in China and the opening up of capital markets, leveling the playing field. Those did not materialize as fast as had hoped. And then there are other things that were not considered, like cybersecurity issues, and now most recently the data protection. I think that China is also now pulling back on the availability of lots of statistical information that had become gungkai, had become open, were no longer considered to be nebu, and now some of it is being pulled back as well. All of these things are leading a number of people in the United States or in the China field to be hesitant about even going back to China, let alone engaging in research. And so that's why China is seen as an international rule breaker. Okay, let me go to the next question. So what about China's role in leading to a more sustainable future? This is a really good question, because I think a lot of people don't realize that China is a country that always walks on two legs. So yes, China continues to burn lots and lots of dirty coal, and the carbon footprint is being damaged by the continuation of reliance on coal. Also, China has built coal plants in BRI countries that enable them to burn coal. And so that's not helping the case. On the other hand, this growth of the electric vehicle industry in China is something not to be sneezed at. The entire high-speed rail network and what's going to come in the future also is helping that. The use of solar technologies is becoming more widespread, combined with the use of wind power in China. And so I think that China is on a pathway to becoming a more sustainable country. At some point, it's going to have to lean to one side. Now, heretofore, China's been playing this reciprocity game with the United States. If you do it, we'll do it. If we do it, you have to do it. But I think the Chinese leadership has finally realized that that game is just a dead end for them. China needs to gain and improve its global image. And I think if China were to take steps to make even more demonstrable improvements, where it improved its carbon footprint and it improved its policies about environmental protection, I think it would command much greater support from across the globe. And I think that it would also gain support from its own citizens. So I'm hoping that they do follow that policies. And I'm optimistic that I think that they'll make some good choices. Okay, next question. Is there a difference in the innovation policy between state-owned and private? Yes. So if you look at the Chinese data, it's very interesting. R&D spending data indicates some 70+% of R&D spending is occurring in enterprises in China. And those enterprises, many of which are state-owned enterprises. But that's not the kind of innovation that I think we really think about when we think about cutting-edge enterprise. In private sector firms really are looking at breaking through the cutting edge or frontier of science and technology. Much of the work that's been done in China in private sector firms is business model innovation, not so much cutting-edge technological innovation. But I think that's starting to happen. I think that through the expanded use of AI in the biotech sector, and I just here would indicate to you that in the new foreign investment incentives, biotech and life sciences have been identified specifically by the Chinese government as industries where they want to bring in more venture capital and more investment capital from abroad. So I think that they see those two areas, biotech and life science in particular, as important areas for the private sector to become more dynamic. These are, I talked before about Friedman command economy, network economy. These are part of the network economy. These are part of the economy that sees the free flow of information, engagement with counterparts around the world. All of these things is very important. And the question will be, was there too much damage done to resuscitate these? Or will they be resuscitated through, for example, the support that Premier Li Qiang now is giving to the Chinese unicorns as part of his push to revitalize the what do you call it, private sector. Okay, next question about the COVID pandemic. So what about vaccine innovation in China? Look, clearly China I think China made a major mistake. It should have taken all vaccines that were available, whether Pfizer, Moderna, et cetera, and use that as a way to become part of a global consortium of companies working on the best vaccines. China did do a good job and engage in some vaccine diplomacy, but clearly China would have benefited a great deal if it had an open door to allowing more of those vaccines to become available. Many of those people in elderly population did not get vaccines in time, and a good number of those passed away, though we will never know really the real number. I would have thought that there was room here, and I think that going forward now, one of the big questions that the U.S. faces in dealing with China is what's going to happen for the next global pandemic. We don't know where it's going to begin, how it's going to begin, but most people who are infectious disease experts agree we're going to have some new pandemic coming around the corner sometime, in the near future. How will the U.S. and China collaboratively respond to that? I'm hoping that the lessons learned from COVID, without pointing fingers, without deciding yes it was the Wuhan Institute virology or not, that we get past this because we really do need one another in order to deal with the next kind of a pandemic. I'm hoping that we can figure out something how to collaborate so that the thing doesn't turn out as badly as it did, particularly in terms of the numbers of deaths. Okay, here's a question about, could the regulation strategies towards social networks and personal data protection be obstacles to China's innovation? And is there any fear in the population or major cultural change for the incorporation of AI? So, as you know, when ChatGPT started taking off, it didn't automatically, take off in China. And for the last 2 or 3 years, a number of people in the Western scientific community have found evidence that Chinese scientists have been discussing the ethics of AI application, how far to let this technology go. Now, of course, in China, there's also a consideration of some of the political dimensions of this, as well as the societal and cultural dimensions, maybe less so about religious issues than in the West. But I think that the ethical, moral application of these technologies is something that the Chinese are actually taking quite seriously. And I believe, frankly, that an area for dialogue between the West and China, it could be fruitful dialogue, would be to discuss these. The question about data protection, look, in some ways, China has data protection policies that are codified. They're ahead of the United States in terms of having a code of conduct that actually does protect the privacy of some individuals. And I think that there are some good aspects to that data privacy. But if it becomes an excuse for the excessive control of data and the lack of data sharing, then that could become a very big obstacle to collaboration in research. And the foreign scientific community would be deterred from engaging because they wouldn't know what data they could access, what data they would get in trouble for possessing. There are some things under which Western scientists are, to be anxious, to be honest, are quite anxious about because they don't know what the rules of the road will be on the ground when these things occur. So I think that China had made great progress in opening up its data through the National Statistical Bureau and through the various ministries and local government agencies about the economy, about different facets. The onset of e-government in China was another step towards greater transparency. I would be chagrined at the fact that if we were going to retreat away from this, because I think that that was a healthy trend in Chinese society. Whether the population really fully understands AI, I'll just tell you one thing. We've already seen huge evidence in Chinese K through 6 as well as K through 12 education, that AI and what AI is and how it can be used is already being taught in Chinese classrooms. And so young people are being exposed to AI at a very young age, not so that they can become some malevolent users of AI or do some strange things, but because I think China understands that society in the next 5 to 10 years, AI is going to proliferate, and they need a literate population who will understand the role of these technologies as the society evolves and develops into the future. So some good news on that forefront, but a lot of ground to cover well into the future. And that's the last question that I see, Enrique.
Right. Okay, Denis, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation, for your responses. I would invite everybody to look more into detail into the webpage of Professor Denis Simon on several of his analyses. There is lots of food for thought for additional issues. Well, I think it's very interesting. Again, as you might imagine, Denis, Latin America, Mexico is also dealing with these innovation issues and in this new triangular relationship between the US and China. So this is very helpful, and we will keep in touch. I invite all the interested colleagues also to see. We invited several years ago Dieter Ernst. I don't know if you know him.
Yes,
from the
I know Dieter very well. We were at the East-West Center in Hawaii together.
Well, it's not only, well, now under difficult circumstances, but a fantastic and beautiful place. And Dieter Ernst has been doing very important work, empirical and theoretical work regarding these discussions in specific global value chains and production networks. No.
Yes.
So again, Denis, thank you very much, and we will keep in touch. I hope you can send us your presentation, and we will upload it. And let's keep in touch. No.
Okay. Yeah. No, I look forward to that, and I have a pet project, which is to look at China's international science and technology relations, and I'm very interested in what China is doing in Latin America, including, of course, Mexico, Central America, and South America. So maybe we can find a project to work on together in the future.
We can talk about this in very concrete terms. No. Thank you for your time. No.
Well, thank you, and thank you everyone again, and thank your audience.
Thank you, Denis. Goodbye. Saludos.
Okay, bye-bye now.